In the 4th century BCE, Thebes forged a weapon unlike any other, an elite army of lovers. The Sacred Band of Thebes was composed of 150 male couples, handpicked not just for skill, but for devotion. Each man fought beside his beloved, bound by oath and affection, believing that love made warriors fearless. At the Battle of Leuctra, they shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility, turning the tide of Greek history. But how did a force built on intimacy and trust become one of the deadliest units of the ancient world? And what happened when they faced Alexander the Great? In the heart of Greece, surrounded by fertile plains and ringed by mountains, stood Thebes, a city both blessed and cursed by its fate. Unlike Athens, with its glory in art and philosophy, or Sparta, with its rigid militarism, Thebes was often underestimated by contemporaries. Yet in the 4th century BCE, from its soil and soul emerged one of the most extraordinary military brotherhoods in history, the Sacred Band of Thebes. Formed of 150 pairs of male lovers, sworn to fight side by side, they became not just a military unit, but a living embodiment of devotion turned into strategy. Their story begins not on battlefields, but in the political chaos of Greece, where alliances shifted like the tides, and where Thebes sought both survival and supremacy. Thebes had long been a city of contradictions. It was steeped in myth, the birthplace of Heracles, the setting of Oedipus' tragic tale, and the land where Cadmus was said to have sown dragon's teeth that sprang into armed men. Yet its political history was less glorious. Often overshadowed by Athens and Sparta, Thebes struggled to assert independence, sometimes allying with one, sometimes with the other. In the Peloponnesian War, Thebes sided with Sparta against Athens, only to later find itself threatened by Spartan dominance. The city's fortunes rose and fell, its people caught between the great powers of Greece. Out of this precarious position, Thebes needed innovation, a way to carve its own destiny. The innovation came in the form of the Sacred Band, a unit whose conception was as radical as it was brilliant. Traditionally, Greek armies were citizen militias, organized into hoplite phalanxes, lines of heavily armed infantry who fought in disciplined formations. Valor and cohesion were essential, but cohesion was often fragile. Soldiers might flee when battles turned, especially if they fought alongside strangers. The Thebans recognized this weakness and sought to replace it with a new kind of bond. Love itself. The idea was simple yet revolutionary. If soldiers were paired with their lovers, men bound not just by oaths but by passion, then their loyalty in battle would be unshakable. No one, it was believed, would abandon his beloved in the line of fire. Each man would fight with doubled courage, protecting his partner and proving himself worthy of his affection. It was a concept rooted in Greek culture, where same-sex love, particularly between older and younger men, was idealized as a bond of mentorship and devotion. Yet in Thebes, this tradition was transformed into a weapon of war. The Sacred Band, according to Plutarch, was first organized by the Theban commander Gorgidas around 378 BCE. Numbering 300 men, it was small compared to the thousands in a typical phalanx. But its strength lay not in numbers, but in the intensity of its bonds. Unlike other units, it was a permanent standing force, trained and maintained at public expense. They lived together, trained together, and fought together, forming a community within the city. Their presence transformed Thebes' military capacity, giving it an elite corps that could anchor its armies in battle. Their formation coincided with a period of great danger and opportunity. Sparta, triumphant after the Peloponnesian War, had imposed harsh dominance across Greece. Thebes itself had suffered under Spartan occupation, with a garrison installed in the Cadmea, its citadel. In 379 BCE, a daring group of Theban exiles returned and, with Athenian support, expelled the Spartans. The liberation of the city ignited a spirit of defiance and renewal. The Sacred Band, born in this context, became both symbol and spearhead of Theban resurgence. The very existence of the Sacred Band challenged Greek norms. While same-sex love was accepted, it was rarely institutionalized in such direct fashion. Other cities might tolerate or even encourage bonds between soldiers, but none built an army unit explicitly from lovers. This gave the band both notoriety and mystique. To admirers, they represented the highest ideal of loyalty. To detractors, they seemed decadent or unnatural. Yet their effectiveness on the battlefield silenced doubts. For the Thebans, love was not a weakness but the strongest shield of all. The Sacred Band quickly proved itself in skirmishes against Sparta, demonstrating discipline and courage that belied its small size. Their presence emboldened the larger Theban army, showing that Spartan invincibility could be challenged. Over time, they became legendary not only for victories but for their ethos. The Greeks, who admired beauty, valor, and devotion, could not ignore the band's embodiment of all three. Still, their formation was not merely romantic idealism. It was also cold calculation. In an era when manpower was limited, a small, elite unit could shift the tide of battle if placed at the right point in the line. The Sacred Band was often deployed at the crucial moment, breaking through enemy phalanxes or holding firm when others faltered. Their reputation grew with each engagement, and so did their symbolic power. They were no longer just a military experiment, but a living statement that courage bound by love could rival even the mightiest empire. In the decades to come, the Sacred Band would face Sparta, the warrior state whose very identity was built on military supremacy. The Spartans had long claimed invincibility in hoplite warfare. But at Leuctra in 371 BCE, the Sacred Band would help shatter that myth, turning the course of Greek history. For Thebes, and for all Greece, the band's victories would mark a moment of transformation. But in their beginning, in the soil of Thebes, amid exile and struggle, the Sacred Band was already a legend in the making. They were 150 couples, 300 men, bound by affection and steel. They carried not only shields and spears, but also the weight of a radical idea, that love could be the strongest foundation for war. Whether they were inspired by romance, strategy, or both, their story would echo long after their deaths, reminding future generations that devotion can shape destiny. Every great experiment begins with a visionary, someone able to see beyond convention and imagine a different path. For the Sacred Band of Thebes, that figure was Gorgidas, a commander whose name is less famous than Epaminondas or Pelopidas, but whose innovation reshaped Theban power and Greek history. In the turmoil of the late 5th and early 4th centuries BCE, when Sparta's shadow loomed over Greece, Gorgidas looked at the weakness of Theban arms and found in love itself a resource for strength. From his vision came the band, 300 men bound not only by oath but by affection. Gorgidas emerged in a city still licking its wounds from humiliation. Thebes had endured Spartan occupation, its citadel, the Cadmea, seized by a garrison in 382 BC. Thebes, proud yet often divided, had been reduced to a client state of its supposed ally. For years, exiles plotted in Athens, and citizens simmered under Spartan watch. When liberation came in 379 BCE, through a daring coup led by Pelopidas and supported by Athenian volunteers, the city regained not only freedom but also a sense of destiny. Yet it was clear that survival would demand more than passion. It would require military innovation. The Spartans remained formidable, their hoplites the terror of Greece. It was here that Gorgidas introduced his bold idea. He understood the dynamics of hoplite warfare, lines of men advancing in phalanxes, shield locked to shield, cohesion essential. Fear often unraveled such formations. Men fought bravely while lines held, but once gaps opened, panic spread and soldiers fled. To counter this, armies needed unbreakable cohesion at crucial points in the line. Gorgidas reasoned that nothing could bind men more firmly than love. As Plutarch later wrote, "A band cemented by friendship grounded upon love is never to be broken and invincible." The concept of pairing lovers in battle was not wholly new in Greece. Plato, in his Symposium, speculated that an army composed of lovers would be unbeatable, for each man would be ashamed to desert his beloved. But Plato's was a philosophical musing. Gorgidas made it reality. He gathered 150 pairs of male lovers, 300 men in total, and trained them as a permanent, professional unit. Unlike the citizen militias that mustered seasonally, the Sacred Band lived together, drilled constantly, and were supported at public expense. They were not merely soldiers. They were a community within Thebes, bound by shared life as much as by battle. This was revolutionary for Greek warfare. Most city-states relied on citizen hoplites, farmers who trained part-time and returned to their fields after campaigns. Sparta maintained a professional army, but even Spartans were tied to communal systems that emphasized discipline over intimacy. The Sacred Band, however, fused professionalism with passion. They were always ready, always united, always driven by bonds deeper than duty. Gorgidas initially deployed them differently from later Theban commanders. According to Plutarch, he spread them across the front line, interspersed among other hoplites, that their valor might be diffused and the whole army made formidable. By placing pairs throughout the line, he ensured that courage was reinforced everywhere. The presence of these elite soldiers strengthened morale and steadied formations. In time, however, later leaders like Pelopidas concentrated the band as a single shock force, but Gorgidas' original vision emphasized integration, the band as inspiration, a leavening of valor throughout the phalanx. The Sacred Band was more than a tactical innovation, it was a social statement. Same-sex relationships, particularly between older and younger men, were accepted in Greek society, often idealized as fostering virtue. But institutionalizing such bonds into a military unit was unprecedented. In Thebes, it became a mark of civic pride. Citizens saw in the band a reflection of their own resilience, a symbol that love and loyalty could defend the city as well as stone walls. The Theban experiment also highlighted the interplay of eros, romantic love, and philia, brotherly loyalty. Greek thinkers debated which bond was stronger, but Gorgidas fused both. In the Sacred Band, lovers fought not only for glory or city, but for each other. To abandon a shield was to abandon a beloved. To die was to die with honor beside one's partner. This emotional dimension gave the band a spirit few armies could match. Critics might have dismissed the idea as soft or indulgent, but results proved otherwise. The Sacred Band quickly distinguished itself in clashes with Sparta and other foes. Their discipline, courage, and unity impressed allies and unnerved enemies. Though small in number, they anchored Theban lines, turning battles by their steadfastness. Word spread that Thebes had created not just an army, but a brotherhood of heroes. Gorgidas himself remained shadowy. Unlike Epaminondas or Pelopidas, his life is not richly recorded. Yet his legacy is immense. He was the architect of the band, the one who transformed philosophical speculation into military reality. His decision to tie military strength to intimate bonds reflected both practical genius and cultural insight. He saw that human passion, often dismissed as weakness, could be weaponized as strength. The Sacred Band under Gorgidas became more than a military unit. It became a myth in the making. To contemporaries, they embodied the power of love and loyalty. To later historians, they symbolized Thebes' brief moment of glory, when a city often overshadowed by Athens and Sparta rose to dominate Greece. And to us, they represent the enduring truth that the strongest armies are built not merely of men and weapons, but of bonds that cannot be broken. In time, under Pelopidas, the Sacred Band would play decisive roles in battles like Tegera and Leuctra, shattering the myth of Spartan invincibility. But even in their earliest days, under the vision of Gorgidas, they proved that courage born of love could transform war. Thebes, once occupied and humbled, now carried within it a living symbol of resistance. The Sacred Band were not merely soldiers. They were guardians of a city's pride, living proof that even in the harsh world of Greek warfare, tenderness could be a source of ferocity. Gorgidas had given his city a weapon, but he had also given the world a story that would echo for millennia. Every legendary force needs a leader who not only commands, but embodies its spirit. For the Sacred Band of Thebes, that leader was Pelopidas. Bold, charismatic, and fiercely devoted to his comrades, he transformed Gorgidas' experiment into a unit that would alter the balance of power in Greece. If Gorgidas was the architect, Pelopidas was the soul. His bond with the band was not distant command, but intimate fellowship. He was both their general and their companion in arms. Pelopidas first rose to prominence during Thebes' darkest hour. In 382 BCE, when Sparta treacherously seized the Cadmea, Thebes' citadel, Pelopidas was among the exiles forced to flee to Athens. For years he lived in hardship, sustained by loyalty to his city and by hatred for its occupiers. Unlike many aristocrats who sought comfort abroad, he devoted himself to preparing for liberation. In 379 BCE, he joined the daring conspiracy that returned to Thebes disguised as hunters, infiltrated the city, and struck down the Spartan-backed oligarchs in a night of blood and vengeance. That act of defiance not only freed Thebes, but also elevated Pelopidas as one of its heroes. His bond with the Sacred Band began soon after. When Gorgidas formed the band, Pelopidas recognized in them kindred spirits, men whose devotion to one another mirrored his devotion to Thebes. He saw that their courage could be the spearhead of Theban resistance. By 378 BCE, Pelopidas was elected Boeotarch, one of the city's magistrates, giving him command of its armies. From then until his death in 364 BCE, his fate was entwined with that of the Sacred Band. What made Pelopidas exceptional was not merely strategy, but presence. Ancient sources emphasize his bravery, his willingness to fight in the front lines, his refusal to use wealth for personal luxury. He was, Plutarch wrote, a man of great courage and justice, who inspired loyalty not by fear, but by example. The Sacred Band thrived under such leadership. They were not distant tools, but his companions. He shared their risks, their hardships, their victories. In him, they saw not only a commander, but a comrade, one whose love of his city and his brothers matched their own. The band's first great test under Pelopidas came at Tegea in 375 BCE. There, with only a small force, including the Sacred Band, he encountered a much larger Spartan army. Outnumbered, most generals would have fled. Pelopidas, however, trusted in the discipline and cohesion of his elite unit. He drew the band into the tightest of formations and hurled them directly at the Spartan center. What followed astonished all Greece. The Sacred Band broke through, killing both Spartan commanders and scattering their enemies. It was the first time in history that a Spartan force had been defeated in open battle by inferior numbers. The myth of Spartan invincibility cracked, and the Sacred Band's reputation blazed forth. Tegea was more than a victory, it was a revelation. For decades, Sparta had dominated Greek warfare through reputation as much as strength. Thebes, once scorned as second-rate, had shown that courage, discipline, and innovation could shatter even Sparta's aura. Pelopidas, at the center of the storm, embodied the new Theban spirit, daring, unyielding, confident. The Sacred Band, once an experiment, was now legendary. Pelopidas' partnership with Epaminondas, his fellow general and friend, further amplified his impact. Epaminondas, philosopher and tactician, provided strategic brilliance. Pelopidas, warrior and leader, provided courage and inspiration. Together they formed one of the greatest duos in Greek history. Where Epaminondas devised the oblique formation that would break Sparta at Leuctra, Pelopidas executed it with ferocity, his Sacred Band striking at the decisive point. Pelopidas' leadership of the band was also deeply personal. Ancient accounts suggest he was close to many within their ranks, bound by ties of friendship and love. Unlike kings who kept aloof, he shared meals and dangers with his men. This intimacy mirrored the very principle of the band, devotion as the core of courage. Pelopidas embodied their ethos, and in turn, they embodied his vision of a Thebes free and proud. His life, however, was not only a string of triumphs. Pelopidas was captured in 368 BCE during a campaign in Thessaly and held prisoner by the tyrant Alexander of Pherai. The Sacred Band mourned, but his friend Epaminondas led a rescue expedition that secured his release. The incident deepened his bond with his comrades, who saw in his suffering proof of his willingness to endure danger for Thebes. Pelopidas' final campaign came in 364 BCE, again in Thessaly, where he faced Alexander of Pherai at Cynocephaly. Though victorious, he fell in battle, struck down as he pressed too far into enemy ranks. His death was mourned across Greece, even by foes, for his reputation as a man of valor and justice was universal. The Sacred Band, devastated, carried his memory into future battles, fighting as if to honor him with every thrust of the spear. Pelopidas' significance to the Sacred Band cannot be overstated. Under Gorgidas, they were an experiment. Under Pelopidas, they became a legend. His courage at Tegera proved their worth. His presence at Leuctra turned them into the hammer that shattered Sparta. His death enshrined them as not merely a military unit, but a brotherhood consecrated by sacrifice. To study Pelopidas is to understand the band not only as warriors, but as human beings bound by devotion. He embodied the paradox of their existence, tender in loyalty, ferocious in battle. Inspired by love, yet feared by enemies. In him, the ideals of the Sacred Band, courage, camaraderie, and devotion, found their fullest expression. History often remembers generals as distant figures, their armies as tools. Pelopidas was different. He was one of them. His life and death reveal why the Sacred Band became more than soldiers. They became a living symbol of how love and loyalty, when fused with courage, could reshape the destiny of nations. By the early 4th century BCE, Greece was a land exhausted yet restless. The Peloponnesian War had drained Athens, leaving Sparta ascendant but overextended. Thebes, once seen as a lesser city, now sought to claim its moment. At the heart of this struggle lay not just armies, but reputations. For over a century, Sparta had been the unquestioned master of hoplite warfare, its soldiers trained from birth in the agoge, its phalanxes feared across Greece. To defeat Sparta in battle seemed impossible. Yet Thebes, guided by Epaminondas and Pelopidas, and emboldened by the Sacred Band, would soon challenge that supremacy. The road to Leuctra was a road toward revolution in Greek history. The rivalry between Sparta and Thebes had deep roots. During the Peloponnesian War, Thebes had fought alongside Sparta against Athens, but after Sparta's victory in 404 BCE, it became clear that Thebes had traded one master for another. Spartan garrisons enforced dominance across Greece, and Thebes itself endured occupation when Phoebidas treacherously seized the Cadmea in 382 BC. The humiliation of seeing Spartan troops in their own citadel burned deeply into Theban pride. The liberation of the Cadmea in 379, carried out by exiles and patriots like Pelopidas, was not just a political turning point but a vow of vengeance. From that moment, conflict with Sparta was inevitable. Yet Thebes was no match in sheer numbers or prestige. Sparta's citizen army may have been small, but its reputation was immense. Spartans were thought to fight with divine ferocity, unbreakable in their discipline, invincible in their phalanx. Cities across Greece lived in awe and fear of them. For Thebes to rise, it had to shatter that aura. This required not only courage but innovation. Enter Epaminondas, the philosophical general whose tactical genius would rewrite the art of war. Unlike most commanders, who followed tradition rigidly, Epaminondas studied deeply, searching for ways to overcome Sparta's advantages. He saw that the Spartans relied on their right flank, where their best soldiers always stood. Their formations were powerful but predictable. He also knew that numbers could be countered by depth. By massing troops heavily on one side, a weaker army could overwhelm even Sparta's finest, so long as the blow struck at the right place. Epaminondas conceived the oblique formation, a concentrated left wing that would hammer the Spartan right, while the rest of the line held back in refusal. It was a daring gamble, requiring discipline and courage of the highest order. For such a plan to work, he needed an elite unit to anchor the decisive strike. That unit was the Sacred Band. Their cohesion, their devotion, their unbreakable morale made them the perfect spearhead. Epaminondas trusted them to hold firm where others might falter, to plunge into the strongest Spartan line and not break. In the Sacred Band, love and loyalty became weapons as powerful as spears and shields. The tension between Thebes and Sparta escalated in the years before Leuctra. Spartan expeditions invaded Boeotia repeatedly, determined to cow Thebes and reassert dominance. The Thebans resisted fiercely, their confidence growing with each clash. At Tegera in 375 BCE, Pelopidas and the Sacred Band had already dealt the Spartans a shocking defeat, albeit in a smaller battle. That victory proved that Spartans could bleed, but it did not yet destroy their aura. A larger, decisive confrontation was coming. The flashpoint came in 371 BCE, When peace negotiations in Sparta broke down, Thebes demanded recognition as the leader of a unified Boeotian League, a demand Sparta refused. Enraged, Sparta marched north with an army under King Cleombrotus I. The two sides met near the village of Leuctra in Boeotia, a place that would soon be etched into history. The Thebans were outnumbered, perhaps 6,000 against 11,000, and faced the most feared warriors in Greece. For most observers, their defeat seemed certain. But in the Theban camp, confidence burned. Pelopidas, Epaminondas, and the Sacred Band prepared for the trial as if destiny itself had called them. Epaminondas laid out his daring plan. The left wing would be stacked 50 ranks deep, with the Sacred Band at its core, directly opposite the Spartan right. The rest of the Theban line would be refused, angled back, holding the field but not engaging heavily. The battle would hinge on one crushing blow. This plan was audacious. No Greek commander before had dared to invert tradition so completely. If the Sacred Band failed to hold or break through, the entire Theban army would collapse. Yet Epaminondas trusted them utterly. He knew their devotion would make them immovable, their courage unyielding. They would not abandon each other. Therefore, they would not abandon Thebes. The days leading up to the battle must have been tense, the Thebans steeling themselves for a test against Sparta's finest. Stories tell of omens and sacrifices, of generals encouraging their men by reminding them that freedom itself was at stake. For the Sacred Band, this battle was also personal. Many of them had fought Spartans before, had seen friends fall, had lived under Spartan occupation. They carried not only shields and spears, but also the weight of memory and vengeance. When the two armies finally drew up at Leuctra, the contrast was stark. The Spartans, as always, stood confident, their scarlet cloaks and long hair marking them as masters of war. The Thebans, fewer in number, braced behind an unorthodox formation, their fate tied to the courage of 300 lovers standing at the point of impact. All Greece watched, for the outcome would determine not just a battle but the balance of power across the land. The road to Leuctra was thus more than a march. It was the culmination of years of humiliation, defiance, innovation, and hope. Thebes had risen from occupation to challenge the greatest military machine of the age. Epaminondas had devised a strategy to overturn tradition. Pelopidas had forged the Sacred Band into a weapon of devotion and courage. The stage was set for one of the most decisive battles in Greek history, where love would meet discipline, and where the fate of nations would turn on the unbreakable bond of 300 men. On the plain near the small Boeotian village of Leuctra in 371 BCE, two armies faced each other across the fields. One represented the iron will of Sparta, the most feared military power in Greece, its soldiers trained from birth, its reputation forged in centuries of victories. The other was Thebes, a city often underestimated, smaller, less renowned, but burning with newfound confidence. At the heart of the Theban line stood the Sacred Band, 300 men, 150 pairs of lovers, sworn to fight side by side. They had been chosen for this moment, not because of numbers, but because of devotion. On that day, the destiny of Greece would shift, and the myth of Spartan invincibility would shatter forever. The Spartan king Cleombrotus I led roughly 11,000 men, including 700 full Spartiates, the elite core of the citizen soldiers who embodied the Spartan ideal. Their right wing, as always, was the strongest, anchored by their best warriors. The Theban army, commanded by Epaminondas, mustered only about 6,000, barely more than half their opponents. Conventional wisdom said they should not even risk battle. But Epaminondas was no ordinary general. He had devised a strategy as radical as it was dangerous. Concentrate overwhelming depth on the left wing, stack it 50 ranks deep, and hurl it directly at the Spartan right. The rest of the Theban line would refuse engagement, angled back to delay the other enemy units. The plan's success hinged entirely on one fact, that the Sacred Band could smash through Sparta's best. The battlefield morning must have been tense. Theban soldiers saw their enemies, the scarlet-cloaked Spartans, standing with calm discipline, their shields gleaming, their hair combed and flowing as ritual demanded. Across from them, the Theban left wing massed, a human wall bristling with spears. At its heart stood the Sacred Band, their shields locked, their spirits bound not only by oaths to Thebes, but by love for the men beside them. Each pair knew the other would not yield. Together they formed an anchor of unbreakable devotion. The battle began with cavalry skirmishes. The Theban horsemen, superior to Sparta's, drove their foes back in confusion. This seemingly minor clash disrupted Spartan cohesion, creating a ripple of unease. Epaminondas seized the moment, ordering his massive left wing forward. Slowly, heavily, like a living wedge, the Theban column advanced, its 50 ranks pressing with irresistible weight. At the forefront, the Sacred Band bore the brunt, their shields clashing with the Spartans in a thunderous crash. The fighting was brutal, spear against spear, shield grinding against shield. Men pressed so tightly they could scarcely move. But here devotion made its mark. Each lover fought not only for himself, but for the life of his partner. Retreat was unthinkable. To fall was to fall together. The Spartans, famed for discipline, met ferocity unlike anything they had faced before. Again and again, the Thebans surged, pushing deeper, their depth beginning to tell. The sheer mass of 50 ranks bore down like a mountain. At the critical moment, the Spartans wavered. King Cleombrotus himself was struck down, mortally wounded amid the crush. His death spread shock through the Spartan line. Leaders tried to rally their men, but confusion and despair seeped into the ranks. The Thebans pressed harder, the Sacred Band driving forward with relentless courage. Step by step, the invincible Spartan right crumbled. When the phalanx finally broke, it was as if a myth shattered. For centuries, Spartans had been seen as unbreakable in hoplite combat. Now, on the field of Leuctra, they fled before men they had long scorned. Theban pursuit cut them down mercilessly. In the end, 400 Spartiates, nearly a third of Sparta's core citizen warriors, lay dead, including Cleombrotus. It was a catastrophe from which Sparta would never fully recover. The Theban losses were light by comparison. The Sacred Band had borne the heaviest fighting, but they stood triumphant. Their courage had not only saved their city, but transformed Greece. By breaking the Spartan myth, they opened the way for Thebes to rise as the dominant power in Greece, if only for a brief, shining moment. The significance of Leuctra cannot be overstated. For generations, Sparta's dominance had been based less on numbers than on reputation. Other cities hesitated to resist, believing Spartan hoplites unbeatable. Leuctra destroyed that illusion. Thebes proved that discipline and innovation could defeat tradition. Epaminondas' tactics reshaped Greek warfare, influencing generals for centuries. But at the center of it all was the Sacred Band. Their cohesion and devotion made the bold strategy possible. Without them, the wedge would have faltered. With them, it shattered the greatest army in Greece. The victory was more than military. It was symbolic. Across Greece, cities whispered in astonishment. Sparta had fallen. The once feared masters of the battlefield had been humbled by Thebes, a city many had dismissed. The shockwave was political as well as psychological. Allies questioned Spartan leadership, and rebellions stirred in subject territories. Thebes had not only defended itself, but altered the balance of power in the Hellenic world. For the Sacred Band, Leuctra was their immortal hour. Their reputation, already strong after Tegera, now became legendary. They were no longer merely an elite corps. They were the embodiment of a new age. Plutarch, centuries later, wrote with admiration of the lovers who had stood unyielding, each pair fighting with a ferocity born of devotion. The Greeks, who idealized love and courage, saw in the Sacred Band proof that these virtues could conquer even Sparta. Yet Leuctra was not only triumph, but also a reminder of fragility. The Theban ascendancy would prove brief. Within decades, Thebes would decline, overshadowed by Macedon. But in that moment, on that battlefield, love and strategy had combined to alter history. The Sacred Band, 300 men, became the hammer that broke a centuries-old empire of fear. When the dust settled, the field of Leuctra was strewn with bodies, Spartan cloaks darkened with blood, their myth lying shattered among the dead. The Thebans buried their fallen with honor, the Sacred Band among them, side by side with their partners. To die together, as they had fought together, was their highest ideal. For those who survived, the victory was not just glory but vindication. the proof that devotion was stronger than tradition, and that love could indeed be a weapon of war. The Battle of Leuctra marked the high point of Theban power and the zenith of the Sacred Band's fame. From that day, they were no longer simply an experiment or an elite unit. They were legends, their name inscribed in the memory of Greece. To speak of Thebes was to speak of the Sacred Band, the lovers who humbled Sparta. And though the tides of history would later sweep them away, Leuctra ensured that their story would never be forgotten. The dust of Leuctra had barely settled when Greece realized that an age had ended. Sparta, the city that for centuries had claimed mastery of the battlefield, had been humbled. The shock reverberated from Peloponnesus to Macedon. Cities that once trembled at the sight of scarlet cloaks now whispered that the Spartans could be defeated. At the center of this transformation stood Thebes, suddenly elevated from second-rate power to the new arbiter of Hellenic affairs. And at the heart of Thebes' newfound strength stood the Sacred Band, no longer merely an elite unit, but a living legend, a brotherhood whose devotion and courage had changed the destiny of Greece. Theban ascendancy after 371 BCE was swift and dramatic. Epaminondas and Pelopidas emerged as the twin architects of this new order. Epaminondas, philosopher general, provided strategy. Pelopidas, warrior hero, embodied courage. Together they carried Thebes to heights it had never known. The city, once occupied by Spartan troops only a few decades earlier, now dictated terms to the very power that had oppressed it. The Sacred Band, their most trusted instrument, became both the spearhead of Theban campaigns and the symbol of its pride. The immediate aftermath of Leuctra was extraordinary. Sparta's authority over the Peloponnesian League began to unravel. Subject cities saw their chance to break free, and Thebes moved swiftly to encourage revolt. Epaminondas marched into the Peloponnesus with a coalition of allies, carrying the war into the very heartland of Sparta. For the first time in centuries, Spartan soil itself trembled beneath enemy boots. The Sacred Band marched proudly in the vanguard, their very presence a reminder of Leuctra's humiliation. One of the most dramatic consequences was the liberation of Messenia. For centuries, Sparta had reduced the Messenians to helots, an enslaved population that toiled in the fields, providing the backbone of Spartan wealth. No power had ever dared to free them until Thebes. With Theban support, Messenia was re-established as an independent state, its capital at the new city of Messene. For Sparta, this was a wound from which it never recovered. Its economic base shattered, its population weakened, the city could no longer project the dominance it once enjoyed. The Sacred Band had helped to deliver not just battlefield defeat, but systemic collapse. For Thebes, these campaigns were a moment of heady triumph. At the Isthmus of Corinth, Theban diplomats proclaimed a new league, challenging Athens and Sparta alike. Thebes was no longer a follower, it was leader. In Greek politics, where prestige mattered as much as power, this reversal was astonishing. The city once mocked as provincial was now hailed as liberator and arbiter. The Sacred Band, marching in shining armor, became the visible embodiment of this newfound prestige. Their reputation spread far beyond Boeotia. In Athens, playwrights and orators spoke of Theban courage with mingled admiration and unease. In Macedon, a young prince named Philip, hostage in Thebes at the time, watched the Sacred Band drill and learned the tactics of Epaminondas. Those lessons would shape his own innovations, which in turn would give rise to the Macedonian phalanx. Thus, the influence of the Sacred Band extended even into the future conqueror who would one day end Thebes' dominance. The Sacred Band themselves basked in their fame. They had proven at Tegera and Leuctra that devotion could triumph over discipline, that 300 men could shatter myths. In Thebes, they were celebrated not only as warriors, but as civic treasures. Supported at public expense, they lived and trained together, their bond both personal and political. The city honored them as the guardians of its liberty, symbols of what Thebes could achieve when united. But ascendancy brought new challenges. With Sparta humbled, Thebes now had to manage leadership of a fractious Greece. Athens, wary of Theban power, drifted back into rivalry. Smaller states resented Theban assertiveness. The Sacred Band, once champions of liberation, sometimes found themselves enforcing Theban dominance over reluctant allies. Pride, always the shadow of glory, began to creep into Thebes' image. Yet in battle, the Sacred Band remained unmatched. At every major campaign, they were placed at the decisive point, trusted above all others to hold or break the line. Their devotion made them reliable in ways no other unit could match. Unlike mercenaries who fought for pay or allies who wavered, the Sacred Band fought for love, for each other, for Thebes. Their presence was a reassurance to Epaminondas and Pelopidas that the most dangerous tasks could be entrusted to those who would never yield. Epaminondas continued to innovate, carrying the lessons of Leuctra into new battles. His use of deep formations and concentrated strikes reshaped Greek tactics. The Sacred Band, trained and disciplined, were the perfect instrument for these strategies. They became not just a shock force but the cutting edge of a military revolution. Other states observed and adapted, but none could replicate the unique cohesion of the band. The Theban ascendancy lasted scarcely a decade, but within that decade the Sacred Band reached the height of their glory. They marched across Greece, humbled Sparta, intimidated Athens, and inspired admiration even among enemies. Their fame spread to distant lands, where tales of lovers who fought and died together captured imaginations. In a world where armies were often transient, the permanence and devotion of the band stood out as something extraordinary. Still, even at the height of their pride, fragility lingered. Thebes was not as wealthy as Athens nor as disciplined as Sparta. Its power depended heavily on the genius of Epaminondas and the ferocity of the Sacred Band. When either faltered, Thebes would be vulnerable. For now, however, victory bred confidence. The Thebans believed themselves to have reshaped Greece forever, and the Sacred Band stood at the very heart of that belief. In their triumph, the band also embodied a paradox. They were proof that love could inspire courage, yet their victories depended on constant war. They were celebrated as symbols of liberty, yet they enforced Theban dominance. They were honored as living wonders, yet their destiny, like that of their city, would prove tragically brief. But in the years after Leuctra, none could foresee the shadows ahead. To contemporaries, the Sacred Band seemed invincible, the very incarnation of Theban pride. When they marched, all Greece remembered that Sparta had fallen before them. When they fought, enemies trembled. In the annals of war, few units have enjoyed such fame in so short a time. The Sacred Band of Thebes had risen from obscurity to legend in a single generation. With Epaminondas and Pelopidas, they carried Thebes to supremacy, turning humiliation into dominance, occupation into empire. They were the flower of Theban pride, the embodiment of an idea as radical as it was powerful, that devotion could make men invincible. The day would come when their pride would meet its reckoning, when another young power would test their strength and love against an empire's ambition. But in the decade after Leuctra, they were unmatched, untouchable, and unforgettable. They were not just Theban soldiers. They were Thebes itself, its pride, its courage, its fragile dream of supremacy in a world of shifting fortunes. If Pelopidas was the heart of the Sacred Band, Epaminondas was its mind. A statesman, philosopher, and general, he possessed a vision of Greece far larger than his city alone. Where Pelopidas embodied courage in the front lines, Epaminondas orchestrated strategies that reshaped the art of war. For the Sacred Band, his genius provided the stage upon which their valor could shine. Without Epaminondas, Thebes might have remained a provincial power. With him, it rose to command Greece for a brief but brilliant moment. Epaminondas was unlike other Greek generals. Born into an aristocratic but modest family, he studied philosophy, particularly the teachings of Pythagoreans, and developed a reputation for wisdom, moderation, and humility. Unlike many leaders who sought wealth or glory, he lived simply, more concerned with virtue than vanity. His contemporaries noted his calm demeanor, his eloquence in speech, and his disdain for personal luxury. In an age when ambition often consumed men, Epaminondas seemed almost an ideal philosopher king. Yet his philosophical depth did not prevent him from mastering war. On the contrary, it sharpened his understanding of strategy, allowing him to see patterns and possibilities invisible to others. His relationship with Pelopidas was crucial. The two men, different in temperament, but united in devotion to Thebes, complemented each other perfectly. Pelopidas inspired with courage, Epaminondas planned with brilliance. Together they forged a partnership that transformed Thebes into a great power, and both recognized in the Sacred Band a unique resource, a unit whose devotion made them not only dependable but capable of executing daring tactics. Epaminondas' greatest innovation was his use of depth and concentration in the phalanx. Traditionally, hoplite armies lined up evenly, matching man to man, shield to shield. Battles were contests of endurance and morale, grinding until one line broke. Epaminondas, however, recognized that victory could be achieved not by symmetry, but by asymmetry. By concentrating forces on a single wing, stacking them 50 men deep, he could smash the enemy's strongest point and unravel the rest. This oblique formation, tested at Leuctra, was a tactical revolution. At its spearhead stood the Sacred Band, whose cohesion made such concentrated assaults possible. The success at Leuctra was not luck, but the fruit of Epaminondas' vision. He dared to challenge tradition, to trust in his men, to see that the myth of Spartan invincibility could be broken. His boldness changed history, but his genius did not end there. In the years that followed, he carried Thebes' armies deep into the Peloponnesus, striking at the very heart of Spartan power. Perhaps his most audacious campaign was the invasion of Laconia itself. No foreign army had entered Sparta's homeland in centuries. The Spartans had always projected power outward, secure behind the Taygetus mountains and their warrior mystique. Yet in 370 BCE, Epaminondas led Theban and allied forces into their very territory. The Sacred Band marched proudly at the forefront, their presence a constant reminder of Leuctra's humiliation. The sight of enemies encamped in Laconia was unthinkable to the Spartans. It shattered their aura further. For the first time, they knew what it was to feel vulnerable at home. Epaminondas also masterminded the liberation of Messenia, freeing the Helots who had been enslaved by Sparta for centuries. With Theban support, the Messenians built a new fortified capital at Messene, securing their independence. This act was more than military, it was ideological. By breaking the system of helotage, Epaminondas struck at the very foundation of Spartan society. Without helots to farm their land, Spartans could not sustain their militaristic lifestyle. The Sacred Band, guardians of this revolution, marched as liberators as well as warriors. His campaigns extended beyond the Peloponnesus. In central Greece, he consolidated Theban power over Boeotia. In Thessaly, he intervened to check tyrants and strengthen allies. His reputation grew not only as a commander, but as a visionary. To some, he seemed intent on creating a new balance in Greece, breaking the dual hegemony of Athens and Sparta and elevating Thebes to equal or greater stature. For a moment, it seemed possible. The Sacred Band thrived under his leadership. He trusted them with the most dangerous tasks, knowing they would never yield. They, in turn, revered him, not as a distant ruler, but as a philosopher general whose calm wisdom guided their destiny. With Epaminondas, they felt invincible, not only because of their own bonds, but because of his ability to place them where they could make the greatest difference. Yet Theban ascendancy under Epaminondas was precarious. The city lacked the resources of Athens' empire or Sparta's traditions. Its power depended heavily on the brilliance of a few men and the courage of the Sacred Band. When Epaminondas led, Thebes triumphed. Without him, its position was less secure. Enemies watched for opportunities, and allies often grew restless under Theban dominance. Epaminondas' character made him both admired and resented. His humility and incorruptibility won trust, but his independence sometimes clashed with the ambitions of others. Unlike most generals, he refused to exploit his position for personal gain. He remained unmarried, lived modestly, and avoided the pursuit of wealth. To his soldiers, this made him a figure of respect. To rival politicians, it made him frustrating, for he could not be manipulated or bribed. The Sacred Band's pride was never greater than under his command. They marched into the Peloponnesus, humbling Sparta. They freed Messenia, a deed unmatched in Greek history. They inspired awe and fear across Greece. And through it all, they carried not just spears but a philosophy, that love, discipline and vision could remake the world. Epaminondas' story, however, foreshadows tragedy. His brilliance, while unmatched, could not outlive him. When he fell in 362 BCE at Mantinea, Theban power began to wane. The Sacred Band would continue, but without his guiding vision, their fate would eventually collide with forces greater than they could withstand. For now, in the decade after Leuctra, Epaminondas stood at the height of his fame, and with him the Sacred Band. Together, they embodied Theban pride and Greek transformation. Where Pelopidas had shown courage and companionship, Epaminondas showed vision and brilliance. The Sacred Band was the fusion of both, heart and mind, devotion and strategy. Their story under Epaminondas reveals not just military genius, but the deeper truth that greatness requires both passion and wisdom. The Sacred Band provided the passion, unbreakable and fierce. Epaminondas provided the wisdom, calm and daring. Together they reshaped Greece and left a legacy still studied centuries later. The Sacred Band of Thebes was never merely 300 men. They were the embodiment of ideas, of love, loyalty, and innovation, that, when harnessed by a leader of vision, could overturn the mightiest of powers. Under Epaminondas, they became not just warriors but history makers. By the early 360s BCE, Thebes stood at the height of its power. Sparta was humbled, Athens wary, and across Greece the name of Epaminondas commanded respect. Yet with prominence came rivalry. Allies resented Theban influence, enemies plotted revenge, and the fragile balance of Greek politics trembled with new tensions. In 362 BCE, these tensions erupted in the Battle of Mantinea, a confrontation that would mark both the zenith of Theban achievement and the tragic fall of its greatest general. For the Sacred Band, it was both a moment of triumph and the beginning of the end. The years leading up to Mantinea were restless. Epaminondas, ever the visionary, sought to extend Theban influence beyond Boeotia and the Peloponnesus. He ventured into Thessaly, where Pelopidas had perished in battle, trying to secure allies and check tyrants. He sailed to the Aegean, challenging Athenian influence. Everywhere he went, he sought to build a web of power that would elevate Thebes to equal footing with the greatest cities. But this ambition bred resistance. Athens, Sparta, and their allies coalesced, determined to check Theban expansion. The stage was set for a decisive showdown. Mantinea, in Arcadia, became the focal point. Thebes, allied with certain Arcadian factions, faced a coalition of Sparta, Athens, and their supporters. For the first time since Leuctra, Epaminondas confronted a grand alliance arrayed to stop him. He brought with him the Sacred Band, now veterans of countless campaigns, their reputation unmatched. They marched not as mere soldiers, but as legends, their armor gleaming, their bond unbroken, their confidence absolute. The battlefield echoed with history. Sparta, still weakened from Leuctra, sought redemption. Athens, though cautious, sought to preserve balance. Thebes sought supremacy. For the Sacred Band, Mantinea was more than a battle. It was a chance to prove, once again, that their love and devotion made them unconquerable. Epaminondas devised yet another daring plan. At Leuctra, he had concentrated his left. At Mantinea, he planned a similar oblique assault, but with even greater subtlety. He feigned weakness on one flank, drawing enemy attention, while secretly massing his best troops, among them the Sacred Band, on his left for a hammer blow. His strategy was to overwhelm the enemy's strongest wing with depth and ferocity, repeating the miracle of Leuctra on a grander scale. When battle began, the Theban cavalry struck first, driving back enemy horsemen and clearing space for the phalanx to advance. Slowly, deliberately, Epaminondas' deep column moved forward. At its core stood the Sacred Band, spears leveled, shields interlocked, devotion shining in their eyes. They knew their task, to strike at the heart of the enemy line, to break it open with the same relentless courage that had humbled Sparta years before. The clash was titanic. The Theban column slammed into the coalition's elite, and the struggle became a storm of bronze and blood. Once again, the Sacred Band bore the brunt, their cohesion and ferocity turning the tide. Step by step, they pushed forward, their sheer depth grinding down resistance. Just as at Leuctra, The enemy wavered before their relentless assault. Victory was within reach. Then came tragedy. In the thick of battle, Epaminondas himself pressed forward, leading from the front as he always did. Suddenly, an enemy spear struck him deep in the chest, piercing through armor and lodging in his body. He did not fall at once, but those around him knew the wound was mortal. The sight of their general wounded spread alarm through the Theban ranks. But Epaminondas, even as his life ebbed, urged his men to hold steady, to push forward, to seize victory before despair could undo them. The Sacred Band fought with renewed fury, as if to honor him with their spears. They drove the enemy back, breaking through and scattering the coalition forces. When the dust settled, Thebes had won. Mantinea, like Leuctra, was a triumph of Theban tactics and Sacred Band valor. The enemy fled, leaving the field to Thebes. But victory was hollow. Epaminondas lay dying, his friends and comrades gathered around him. According to Plutarch, when asked whom Thebes would appoint as commander after him, he replied, "You will make peace." He knew that his death meant the end of Theban ascendancy. He pulled the spear from his chest, and with that final act, Thebes lost the man whose vision had made it great. The Sacred Band mourned as no unit had ever mourned before. For them, Epaminondas was not only a general but a guardian of their destiny. With his fall, their glory seemed dimmed, even in victory. They had triumphed on the battlefield, but the larger war, the struggle for supremacy in Greece, was lost. Without Epaminondas' wisdom, Thebes could not hold its fragile empire. Mantinea marked the end of an era. Greece itself, fractured and weary, recognized the futility of endless war. The victory of Thebes was too costly. The coalition, though defeated, was not destroyed. In the years that followed, no city would dominate as Athens, Sparta, and now Thebes had once done. Into that vacuum would soon step Macedon, under Philip II, reshaping the Greek world forever. For the Sacred Band, Mantinea was both triumph and tragedy. They had proven once more that their devotion could conquer any foe, that 300 lovers could embody the courage of a nation. Yet they also saw that even the strongest band of brothers could not preserve a city's greatness without wise leadership. Epaminondas' death was the turning point. Without him, Thebes' star began to fade. Still, their pride remained. The Sacred Band returned to Thebes as heroes, their heads held high. They carried the memory of Mantinea as proof that they were invincible in battle. But deep inside, they must have sensed that their destiny was no longer to shape Greece's future, but to stand as its most poignant legend. Their time was not yet over, but the forces gathering in Macedon would one day test them in ways even they could not withstand. The Sacred Band's glory shone brightest at Mantinea, even as the sun of Theban power set. They had fought for love, for Thebes, for Epaminondas. They had triumphed against the greatest cities of Greece. But history, relentless and unforgiving, was already turning. Their greatest test still lay ahead. After Mantinea in 362 BCE, the Sacred Band of Thebes stood as veterans of triumph, their shields and spears still stained with the memory of victory. Yet the death of Epaminondas on that battlefield marked not only the loss of a general, but the loss of Theban ascendancy itself. For a brief moment, the Sacred Band had helped elevate Thebes to the pinnacle of Greek power, defeating Sparta and humbling Athens. But now, without their philosopher general, the city lacked vision. What followed was an age of uncertainty, an era in which the Sacred Band remained glorious but increasingly found themselves fighting in the twilight of Thebes' greatness, as a new power quietly rose in the north, Macedon. The political landscape of Greece after Mantinea was fractured and fatigued. Thebes, though victorious, could not consolidate power. Athens remained wary, Sparta broken but not destroyed, and other city-states longed only for respite from endless wars. Epaminondas had been the glue that bound Theban ambition to coherent strategy. Without him, Thebes could not command allies with the same authority. The Sacred Band, though undefeated, now carried the burden of being symbols of a city whose leadership was faltering. Despite this decline, the band remained at the heart of Theban pride. They continued to train, live, and march as an elite corps, their discipline and devotion undiminished. In Theban festivals and processions, They stood as the embodiment of the city's courage. Young men looked to them as the highest expression of valor and love entwined. Their reputation spread far beyond Boeotia. Even in rival cities, they were spoken of with a mix of awe and envy. 300 men whose devotion made them unconquerable in battle. But history rarely allows legends to rest. While Thebes looked inward, Macedon stirred. Once dismissed as a barbarous kingdom on the northern fringe of Greece, Macedon was being transformed under the leadership of Philip II. Ironically, Philip had spent years as a hostage in Thebes during his youth, absorbing the lessons of Epaminondas and studying the tactics of the Sacred Band. He had watched them drill, seen their cohesion, and understood the power of depth in phalanx formations. Returning to Macedon, he rebuilt his army, introducing innovations that combined Theban tactics with Macedonian resilience. His soldiers wielded the sarissa, a longer spear that extended their reach. His phalanx was deeper, more flexible, and drilled with relentless precision. Step by step, Philip forged an army that could match and surpass anything Greece had known. For the Sacred Band, Macedon's rise was an ominous shadow. They represented the old ideal of the hoplite phalanx, perfected by devotion but rooted in tradition. Philip represented a new age of professional armies, organized, permanent, and commanded by a monarch rather than by shifting city-state coalitions. The Sacred Band had once seemed invincible. Now, they would face an enemy who had learned from them and built something even greater. In these years, Thebes oscillated between pride and insecurity. On one hand, they still commanded respect. Their victories at Leuctra and Mantinea were not forgotten, and the Sacred Band remained a force to reckon with. On the other, Thebes was increasingly isolated. Athens sought alliances elsewhere, and Sparta, though crippled, remained hostile. Smaller states no longer looked to Thebes for leadership. The Sacred Band continued to fight in border skirmishes and campaigns, but each year it became clearer that their city no longer shaped the destiny of Greece. Yet within the band, the flame of devotion burned as fiercely as ever. They were more than soldiers, they were a living ideal. Each man was bound to his lover, each pair part of a greater brotherhood. In an age of shifting politics, they remained constant, a reminder of Thebes' brief but brilliant ascendancy. To Theban citizens, their very presence was reassurance. Even if leaders faltered, even if allies deserted, the Sacred Band would never break. The paradox of their final decades was stark. Militarily, they were still among the finest troops in Greece, yet politically, Thebes was losing relevance. Their glory lived in memory and in the eyes of those who marched past their ranks in festivals. But in practical terms, they stood increasingly alone against a world that was changing. The dream of Theban supremacy, born at Leuctra, had already faded by the time Macedon rose to challenge them. Philip of Macedon advanced carefully, first securing his borders, then extending influence through diplomacy and marriage, and finally through war. He avoided direct confrontation with Thebes and Athens until he was ready, using time to perfect his army. By the 350s BCE, Macedon's power was undeniable. The Greeks, distracted by internal quarrels, underestimated him. But the Sacred Band, who had once humbled Sparta, knew that war with Macedon was inevitable. They would be called upon to defend not only Thebes, but the old order of Greece itself. In this period between glory and decline, the Sacred Band became more than warriors. They became symbols of resistance. To some, they were relics of Theban pride. To others, they were the last hope that Greek freedom could be defended against Macedonian monarchy. Their story, once about innovation and triumph, was now about endurance in the face of overwhelming change. Even as their city weakened, the Sacred Band held their identity with unyielding pride. They were undefeated in open battle. Their cohesion, their love, their devotion, these remained unbroken. The tragedy was not that they lost their spirit, but that the world around them was shifting toward a scale and organization even they could not match. Thus, the Sacred Band stood in the twilight of Theban greatness, proud, undefeated, admired, yet destined to meet a power that had learned from them and grown beyond them. The shadow of Macedon lengthened over Greece, and the band, still radiant in devotion, prepared to face the test that would define their final chapter. They had defeated Sparta, liberated Greece, and marched into glory under Epaminondas. Now they would stand against Philip, the pupil who had studied their ways, and discover whether even love could withstand the weight of empire. The twilight of Thebes coincided with the dawn of Macedon. In the north, beyond the traditional centers of Greek power, a kingdom once scorned as half-barbarian was undergoing a transformation under the hand of a single man, Philip II. His rise would reshape the political map of Greece, not only through conquest, but through the creation of a new kind of army, an army forged with lessons learned during his time in Thebes. For the Sacred Band, Philip was a paradox, a student who had studied their brilliance, and ultimately, the foe who would test their invincibility. Philip's youth was shaped by defeat. Born in 382 BCE, he grew up in a kingdom fractured by dynastic struggles and threatened on every border. Macedon was rich in resources but poor in prestige. Its nobles were quarrelsome, its army disorganized, its reputation among Greeks contemptuous. When Philip was sent as a hostage to Thebes in the 360s BCE, few would have guessed that this boy from the north would one day master Greece. Yet Thebes proved to be his school, and the Sacred Band his living textbook. In Thebes, Philip observed Epaminondas' revolutionary tactics and watched the Sacred Band drill. He saw firsthand the power of depth in phalanx formation, the way cohesion and discipline could break even Sparta. He understood that devotion and unity could turn soldiers into an unbreakable force. More than any Athenian tutor or Spartan legend, it was Thebes that shaped Philip's military mind. When he returned to Macedon after his brother's death in 359 BCE, he carried with him not only ambition but a blueprint for transformation. Philip inherited a kingdom in chaos. The Illyrians threatened from the west, the Thracians from the east, rival claimants within his own family from the palace. Macedon's army had been shattered, yet within 2 years, he had rebuilt it. His genius lay not in copying Thebes, but in improving upon it. He retained the deep phalanx, but equipped it with the sarissa, a pike over 5 meters long, giving his soldiers reach no hoplite could match. He drilled his men into a permanent, professional force, no longer seasonal farmers, but career warriors loyal to their king. He added cavalry as a decisive arm, particularly the elite companion cavalry, which he led personally in battle. With infantry that held firm and cavalry that struck like lightning, Philip created an army unlike anything Greece had faced. His reforms were matched by cunning diplomacy. Philip married strategically, secured alliances, and played Greek states against one another. He presented himself at times as a liberator of cities, at other times as their protector, but always with the ultimate goal of Macedonian dominance. By the mid-350s BCE, Macedon was no longer a weak frontier kingdom. It was the rising star of the Greek world. For Thebes, the rise of Philip was both familiar and threatening. They recognized his tactics, for they were born of their own innovations. Yet they underestimated him. Many Greek states dismissed Macedon as peripheral, unwilling to believe that a northern king could impose his will upon the proud polis of the south. The Sacred Band, undefeated in open battle, must have felt confident that their devotion could withstand even this new threat. But Philip was not merely another Greek general. He was an architect of empire. As Macedon expanded, absorbing Thessaly, Thrace, and other territories, tensions with southern Greece deepened. Athens grew alarmed, its navy threatened by Philip's reach. Thebes, once ascendant, now found itself caught between mistrust of Athens and fear of Macedon. The Sacred Band continued to train and march, still the pride of Thebes, but their role shifted from spearhead of liberation to bulwark of a city struggling to preserve independence. Philip's campaigns displayed a mastery of combined arms. At Crocus Field in 352 BCE, his forces crushed the Phocians, further proving the strength of his army. Everywhere he went, he demonstrated not only tactical brilliance, but strategic patience. He would advance step by step, securing territory, building alliances, and isolating enemies. By the 340s, it was clear to all that Macedon was destined to dominate Greece unless united resistance could stop it. The Sacred Band, veterans of Leuctra and Mantinea, now prepared for a new kind of war. Unlike Sparta, which relied on prestige, or Athens, which relied on sea power, Macedon fielded a relentless professional army. The band's devotion, unbroken for decades, would be tested not only by numbers, but by an enemy who had studied their very soul. Philip's army was, in a sense, the sacred band writ large, cohesive, disciplined, bound by loyalty not to lovers, but to a king whose vision transcended any single city. In Thebes, pride persisted. The victories of the past, Tegera, Leuctra, Mantinea, were still celebrated. The sacred band still marched as the heart of the city's army, their 150 couples the living embodiment of Theban courage. But beneath the pride lay unease. Thebes had lost Epaminondas, and no leader of equal genius had arisen. Philip, meanwhile, was Epaminondas reborn, yet more ruthless, more ambitious, more relentless. The clash was inevitable. By the late 340s, Athens and Thebes, long rivals, set aside mistrust and allied to resist Macedon. It was a measure of Philip's power that enemies so bitterly divided would unite against him. For the sacred band, this alliance offered a final chance to prove themselves once more as Greece's shield. They would fight not just for Thebes, but for all of Hellas. The stage was set for Chaeronea in 338 BCE, a battle that would determine the fate of Greece. Philip would lead his reformed phalanx and cavalry. The sacred band would stand as the unbreakable core of Theban resistance. On that field, the student who had once watched them drill would meet his teachers in mortal combat. The rise of Philip II was not simply the story of a king, it was the story of transformation. He took the lessons of Thebes and Sparta, fused them with his own vision, and created an army that would conquer Greece and prepare the way for Alexander the Great. For the sacred band, it was a tragic irony. They had inspired the very tactics that would one day destroy them. They had once humbled Sparta, but now they would face a Macedonian phalanx deeper, stronger, and more disciplined than any they had known. The sacred band remained undefeated as they marched toward Chaeronea. Their devotion was intact, their pride unshaken. Yet the tide of history had turned. Their greatest test was yet to come, and in it lay both their doom and their immortal glory. The summer of 338 BC dawned heavy with anticipation. On the plains near the small Boeotian town of Chaeronea, the fate of Greece was about to be decided. On one side stood the allied forces of Athens and Thebes, bitter rivals now united by necessity, determined to halt the relentless advance of Macedon. On the other stood Philip II, king of Macedon, and his young son Alexander, commanding an army that was not only formidable in numbers, but revolutionary in design. At the very heart of the allied army, anchoring the Theban line, stood the sacred band. They had been forged in the fires of Leuctra, proven at Tegera, and glorified at Mantinea. Now, after decades of triumph, they would meet their greatest and final test. The battlefield was set like a stage for tragedy. Philip commanded roughly 30,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, drilled into a machine of precision and cohesion. His phalanx, armed with the sarissa, towered over the traditional hoplite spears of the Greeks. His companion cavalry, fierce and disciplined, waited for the decisive charge. Opposing him were the Athenians on the allied left, renowned for their orators, but less so for their battlefield prowess, and the Thebans on the right, their pride embodied in the sacred band. In all, the allies fielded around 35,000 men, but cohesion was fragile and strategy uncertain. Thebes carried the weight of pride, Athens the weight of rhetoric. Macedon carried the weight of destiny. As dawn broke, the armies drew up in lines, the sun glinting off bronze helmets and scarlet cloaks. The sacred band stood shoulder to shoulder, their shields gleaming, their spears poised. Each man looked not only at the enemy, but at the lover beside him. To retreat would be to betray love, to fall would be to fall together. Their entire ethos, their entire legend, was distilled into that moment. They had never known defeat in open battle, and they intended to keep it so. The clash began with maneuver and feints. Philip, cunning as ever, advanced his right wing slowly, deliberately retreating step by step before the Athenians. To the untrained eye it seemed like weakness. To Philip's soldiers it was calculated. The Athenians, believing they pressed an advantage, surged forward, breaking formation in eagerness. Philip drew them further from the center, stretching their line thin, creating the very gap he needed. Meanwhile, on the Macedonian left, a young Alexander, barely 18, led the companion cavalry in concert with the infantry. His target was the Theban right, the strongest point of the Allied line, where the Sacred Band stood. The collision was titanic. Alexander's charge crashed into the Theban line with the weight of youthful fury and disciplined steel. Behind him, the Macedonian phalanx pressed forward, sarissas bristling like a wall of thorns. The Sacred Band met them head-on, their formation tight, their courage absolute. Shield locked to shield, spear striking spear, they held the line against the onslaught. For a moment, it seemed as if history might repeat itself, that devotion and discipline might once again break a stronger foe. But this was not Sparta at Leuctra. The Macedonian phalanx was deeper, its reach longer, its cohesion unyielding. Wave after wave pressed forward, driving the Sacred Band back step by step. Alexander himself fought at the front, his youth aflame with ambition, his presence electrifying his troops. The band resisted with all the ferocity of men who would rather die than yield. Lovers fought side by side, each protecting the other, each determined to prove that their devotion was stronger than iron. As the battle raged, Philip's feigned retreat on the right turned into advance. The Athenians, overextended and disordered, collapsed under the renewed Macedonian push. Panic spread along their line, and the center began to buckle. Only the Thebans held firm, the Sacred Band refusing to break even as the tide turned against them. Encircled, outnumbered, pressed from front and flank, they fought on. The slaughter was terrible. Surrounded, the Sacred Band made no attempt to flee. To flee was to abandon their oath, their lovers, their very identity. Instead, they fought in place, a living wall of defiance. One by one, they fell, each beside the man he loved. Ancient sources tell us that of the 300, none fled, and nearly all were slain. They did not retreat, did not surrender. They died where they stood, a final testament to the ideal that had made them invincible in spirit, if not in outcome. When the battle ended, Macedon was victorious. Greece lay at Philip's feet, its independence broken. Athens surrendered its hopes, Thebes its pride. Philip, walking the field after the battle, came upon the bodies of the Sacred Band, piled where they had made their stand. He was struck not with scorn, but with awe. According to Plutarch, when told that this was the band of lovers, he wept and said, "Perish miserably they who suspect that these men either did or suffered anything that was base." Even their conqueror recognized their glory. The death of the Sacred Band at Chaeronea was both an ending and a beginning. It ended Theban power, for without them the city was defenseless against Macedon. It ended the independence of the Greek city-states, for Philip's victory paved the way for Macedonian hegemony and, later, Alexander's empire. But it also began the legend of the band as eternal symbols of devotion. Their stand, though feudal militarily, became immortal in memory. To the Greeks who survived, their sacrifice was both tragedy and inspiration. In Athens, orators mourned the loss of liberty, but even there the Sacred Band's valor was admired. In Thebes, grief was profound, for with the band lay buried not just 300 men, but the pride of a city. Their tomb at Chaeronea, marked by a great stone lion, stood as monument and warning. Love and courage can defy fate, but even they cannot always prevail. Yet in another sense, they had triumphed. Though Macedon won the field, the Sacred Band won immortality. No other unit in Greek history is remembered with such reverence. Their story outlived Thebes, outlived Philip, even outlived Alexander. They became a symbol of the unbreakable bond between men, of courage rooted not in fear of shame alone, but in devotion to one another. They showed that the greatest armies are built not only on discipline, but on love. At Chaeronea, the Sacred Band of Thebes died to the last man. But in their death, they achieved the immortality they had sought in life, to be remembered not as individuals, but as a brotherhood, a union of heart and steel, who stood against empire and fell together. Their end was their glory, their defeat their triumph, their silence louder than victory. When the dust of Chaeronea settled in 338 BCE, The battlefield was strewn with silence, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the caw of circling birds. Among the corpses lay the Sacred Band of Thebes, every man cut down where he stood, their shields overlapping, their bodies entwined with those of their lovers. They had fulfilled their oath never to flee, never to abandon one another, never to betray the bond that defined them. Though Thebes had lost the battle, the Sacred Band had sealed its legend. Their death was not obscurity, but immortality. In the aftermath, grief swept through Thebes. The city, once proud, now humiliated, mourned not only the defeat of its army, but the annihilation of its greatest treasure. The Sacred Band had been the pride of Thebes, the embodiment of its brief ascendancy, the living symbol of its freedom. Now they were gone, extinguished in a single day. Families wept not only for sons and brothers, but for pairs of lovers, double funerals of devotion and tragedy. For Thebes, the loss was more than military. It was cultural, spiritual, existential. Yet even their conqueror honored them. Philip II of Macedon, surveying the field, is said to have paused in awe before the bodies. When told that this was the Sacred Band, composed of 150 pairs of lovers, he shed tears and declared that nothing was more noble than men who had perished for one another. His respect, unusual for a conqueror, testified to the band's extraordinary reputation. Though Philip had destroyed them, he recognized that their devotion transcended defeat. In his own way, he acknowledged that victory could not diminish their honor. In time, a monument was raised, the Lion of Chaeronea. Carved in massive stone, it stood sentinel over a burial mound where the Sacred Band was interred. The lion, proud and solemn, symbolized both courage and mourning. Its silent gaze watched over the battlefield, a reminder to all who passed that here lay men who had chosen death over dishonor. Beneath the mound, archaeologists in modern times uncovered the remains of 254 skeletons, aligned in rows, evidence of the band's final stand. The monument was both grave and parable, a stone voice proclaiming that devotion is stronger than fear. The Lion of Chaeronea became a site of memory for all of Greece. To some, it was a warning against hubris, a reminder of the futility of resisting Macedon. To others, it was a shrine of valor, proof that courage could outlive defeat. For Thebans, it was both pride and grief, a scar that never healed. Each festival, each procession, carried the absence of the band like a phantom. Their empty place in parades was more eloquent than words. The memory of the Sacred Band spread far beyond Thebes. In Athens, where orators like Demosthenes railed against Macedon, the story of the band's last stand became a rallying cry for liberty. To poets, their sacrifice was inspiration. To philosophers, a paradox of defeat transformed into triumph. Even in distant lands, travelers spoke of the 300 lovers who had died together, their devotion shining brighter than victory. The Lion of Chaeronea was not merely a monument to the dead, it was a symbol of how Greece remembered heroism. Unlike statues of gods or kings, it honored ordinary men elevated by love and courage. It embodied the Greek belief that Kleos, glory, was not found in survival alone, but in the manner of one's death. The Sacred Band had chosen death without retreat, and in doing so, they achieved glory beyond conquest. Over the centuries, the memory of the band became part of Greek identity. Even as Macedon, and later Rome, absorbed Greece, the story of the band persisted in writings and traditions. Plutarch, himself a Boeotian writing centuries later, preserved their tale with reverence. His accounts ensured that the Sacred Band would never be forgotten, that their devotion would echo across ages. For Plutarch, the band was more than warriors. They were proof of the power of love to inspire ultimate sacrifice. The Lion of Chaeronea also carried a deeper symbolism. The lion was not only courage, but community. Lions fight together, live in prides, defend one another. To place a lion over the band's grave was to declare that these men had fought as one, a pride bound by devotion. The stone beast roared silently across centuries, its message clear. These men were not defeated. They were eternal. In modern times, when the mound was excavated and the lion restored, the Sacred Band regained new life in imagination. The skeletons lying side by side, many entwined, confirmed the ancient accounts. Archaeology gave flesh to legend, proof that the Sacred Band was no mere story but a reality. Scholars, poets, and lovers alike drew inspiration from the discovery, seeing in those bones the enduring truth that love can be as strong as steel. The Lion of Chaeronea thus bridges past and present. For ancient Greeks, it was mourning and pride. For us, it is memory and inspiration. It reminds us that even in defeat, courage endures. The Sacred Band did not survive the battle, but they survived in story, in stone, in the hearts of those who honor devotion. Their tomb is not only a grave, but a shrine to ideals larger than war, loyalty, love, and the refusal to surrender. Thebes never recovered from Chaeronea. Within a few decades, Alexander the Great would raze the city itself, sparing only temples and the house of Pindar the poet. Yet, even in ruin, Thebes' greatest gift to history remained: the memory of the Sacred Band. Their story transcended the fall of their city, outliving stone walls and political fortunes. The Lion of Chaeronea, standing solitary on the plain, was Thebes' final voice. Thus, the Sacred Band achieved in death what few armies achieve in life: immortality. Their defeat became their triumph, their silence their most eloquent cry. The lion that guarded their tomb was not only for Thebes, but for all who seek meaning in courage and devotion. It proclaimed that love is not weakness, that devotion can inspire valor beyond calculation, and that even in death, the bonds of the Sacred Band could not be broken. The Sacred Band of Thebes did not fade into obscurity with their burial at Chaeronea. Instead, they took on a second life, not in arms but in memory. For centuries, philosophers, poets, and historians reflected upon their unique union of love and warfare. They became more than a military unit. They became a symbol, a paradox, and a question that Greek thinkers could not ignore. Could love, the most intimate of human bonds, be harnessed as the strongest foundation for courage? Their story lived on in debate, in admiration, and in the uneasy tension between eros and eurydice, desire and virtue. Greek culture had long entertained the notion that love could inspire valor. Plato, in his Symposium, mused that an army of lovers would be unbeatable, for no man would shame himself before the eyes of his beloved. To flee would be cowardice witnessed by the one whose opinion mattered most. To fight bravely would be the highest proof of devotion. The Sacred Band transformed this speculation into lived reality. In them, the hypothesis was tested on the battlefield, not in the academy. At Tegera, at Leuctra, at Mantinea, the theory proved itself in blood and bronze. Yet not all Greek thinkers agreed. Xenophon, the soldier philosopher and admirer of Sparta, offered little respect to Theban innovations. To him, military excellence came from discipline and training, not from passion. The Spartan model, in his eyes, was purer, men fighting not for lovers but for their polis, their laws, their ancestors. The very idea of institutionalizing pairs of lovers into an army may have struck him as decadent, softening the harsh iron of martial virtue. That tension between admiration and suspicion would follow the band through history. Still, their record was irrefutable. In open battle, they were never defeated until Chaeronea, and even then they did not break. They died to the last man. To admirers, this was the ultimate vindication of Plato's ideal. Love could indeed create unbreakable courage. To critics, it was proof only of devotion, not of strategy, for devotion could not save them from Macedon's new military system. The debate was not about whether they were brave, but about what their bravery meant. In philosophy, the Sacred Band became a touchstone for discussions of the nature of love. The Greeks distinguished between eros, romantic or sexual passion, and philia, deep friendship or brotherhood. In the Sacred Band, both were fused. Each pair combined affection with loyalty, desire with duty. This fusion fascinated thinkers, for it blurred the boundaries between private and public, between personal love and civic obligation. The Sacred Band was not merely a military unit. It was a social experiment, testing whether the deepest human bond could also be the strongest civic bond. Plutarch, writing centuries later, framed them as an ideal of love ennobled by courage. He described them not as effeminate or indulgent, but as men whose devotion made them heroes. For Plutarch, who sought moral lessons in history, the Sacred Band proved that love could elevate virtue, transforming desire into discipline, passion into power. His account ensured that future generations would see them not as curiosities, but as exemplars. Greek poets, too, found inspiration in their story. The image of lovers dying side by side, refusing to yield, resonated deeply in a culture that celebrated Cleo's glory earned through noble death. The Sacred Band offered not only the glory of arms, but the glory of devotion. To fall beside one's beloved was a tragedy, but also a triumph, a form of immortality more intimate than monuments. Their memory lingered in elegies, in songs sung at festivals, in whispers at symposia where men debated whether passion was strength or weakness. In politics, their legacy was more complex. For Thebes, they remained a point of pride long after the city itself was destroyed by Alexander. To honor them was to honor Thebes' brief hour of greatness, when it had humbled Sparta and stood at the forefront of Greece. For Athens, their story was both inspiring and unsettling. Inspiring, because they had fought bravely for liberty against Macedon. Unsettling, because their devotion highlighted Athens' own divisions and failures. For Sparta, they were an anomaly, proof that courage could come from unexpected sources, yet also a challenge to Spartan ideology. Beyond philosophy and politics, the Sacred Band raised deeper questions about the relationship between love and death. Was their devotion noble because it made them fearless, or tragic because it condemned them to die together? Did they prove that love can conquer fear, or that even love cannot conquer fate? These questions echoed through Greek thought, leaving no simple answers. The Sacred Band was not merely history. They were a mirror in which Greeks examined their own ideals of valor, loyalty, and desire. Their legacy also touched on gender and identity. In a culture where male love was celebrated, yet bounded by norms, the Sacred Band pushed boundaries. They institutionalized what elsewhere was private, made public what elsewhere was discreet. In doing so, they redefined what it meant to be warriors, showing that tenderness and ferocity were not opposites, but allies. To later generations, they stood as proof that courage was not diminished by love, but intensified by it. Even their enemies could not deny their greatness. Philip Tus reported tears at Chaeronea. His respect for their sacrifice revealed that their story transcended politics. He had destroyed them, yet he honored them. In that paradox lies the band's true power. They commanded admiration even in defeat, even from those who had every reason to scorn them. Few armies in history have achieved such moral victory in the moment of military annihilation. As centuries passed, the Sacred Band remained a subject of fascination. In philosophy, they embodied Plato's ideal. In history, they exemplified Theban pride. In poetry, they symbolized tragic devotion. In memory, they became immortal. Their death at Chaeronea transformed into legend. Love and valor, fused in their brotherhood, outlived their city, their enemies, and even the world they fought to defend. The Sacred Band was not merely 300 men who fought and died together. They were a question, a challenge, a story that demanded retelling. They asked Greeks, and by extension, all humanity, what is the strongest bond? What makes men brave? Is it duty to city, fear of shame, love of glory, or love of each other? Their answer lay in their lives and their deaths. And though philosophers might debate, though critics might sneer, their silence at Chaeronea spoke louder than all arguments. In the end, the Sacred Band became philosophy incarnate. They embodied the speculation of Plato, the moral lesson of Plutarch, the poetry of valor sung across Greece. They proved that love is not weakness but power, not indulgence but inspiration. And though they perished, their story endured, challenging each new generation to reconsider what it means to fight, to love, and to die with honor. In the years following Chaeronea, Greece no longer belonged to the city-states. Philip II of Macedon stood as master of the Hellenic world, his hegemony sealed not only by victory, but by the symbolic annihilation of the Sacred Band. Athens, though defeated, was spared and treated with care, for its fleet and prestige still carried weight. Thebes, however, was diminished. The city that had once humbled Sparta and produced the Sacred Band now found itself shackled by Macedon's dominance. For Thebes, the fate of its most beloved sons foreshadowed its own destiny: brief greatness, followed by ruin. Philip did not immediately destroy Thebes. Indeed, after Chaeronea, he attempted conciliation, establishing the League of Corinth and presenting himself as leader of a united Greece against Persia. Yet beneath this veneer, Thebes simmered with resentment. Its pride wounded, its army broken, its greatest heroes lying beneath the lion of Chaeronea. The city endured humiliation with clenched fists. The Sacred Band's death was not only a military loss, but a moral wound that would never heal. The real catastrophe came after Philip's assassination in 336 BCE, when his son, Alexander the Great, ascended the throne. Young, ambitious, and burning with the desire to prove his strength, Alexander faced immediate revolts among the Greek cities. Thebes rose first, sensing opportunity in the transition. They longed to shake off Macedonian chains, to reclaim the freedom their sacred band had died defending. But the rebellion was rash. Thebes no longer possessed the strength or allies to resist Macedon's might. In 335 BCE, Alexander marched swiftly into Boeotia with a force so large and disciplined that resistance was hopeless. Thebes, defiant to the last, refused surrender. The Macedonians stormed the walls, and what followed was devastation. The city was razed, its citizens slaughtered or sold into slavery, its temples desecrated. Only the house of the poet Pindar was spared, a gesture of respect for Greek culture. Thebes, the birthplace of Heracles, the city of Epaminondas and Pelopidas, was erased from the map. Yet even in destruction, memory lingered. Among the ruins, the tomb of the Sacred Band at Chaeronea remained untouched. Alexander, perhaps recalling Philip's reverence for them, did not desecrate their resting place. The Lion of Chaeronea still stood watch, even as Thebes itself fell into silence. In this paradox lay the band's afterlife, their city destroyed, but their memory preserved, honored even by the conquerors who extinguished their homeland. For Greece, the destruction of Thebes was a chilling message. The city that had once defied Sparta and humbled the strongest of armies could be obliterated in a single campaign. Independence was finished. Macedon ruled supreme. Athens bowed. Sparta sulked in diminished isolation, and the dream of the polis as the center of Greek freedom faded. Yet in this new world, the Sacred Band's legend grew. They became not just a Theban memory but a Greek symbol, the embodiment of courage lost in the twilight of the city-states. Writers and philosophers, centuries later, continued to reflect on them. Plutarch, himself a Boeotian, treated their story with reverence. He saw in their lives and deaths a moral lesson, proof that love could inspire valor beyond fear. To him, their devotion ennobled Thebes, even in defeat. Other historians echoed this sentiment, describing the band not merely as warriors but as martyrs of liberty, cut down by the tide of empire, yet never dishonored. The afterlife of the Sacred Band also lived in monuments. The Lion of Chaeronea endured, its silent roar a reminder to travelers and conquerors alike that here lay men who chose death over retreat. Even when Thebes was rebuilt decades later, it never regained its old power. But the lion remained, greater than walls or temples, a symbol that outlived the city itself. In its shadow, memory transcended ruin. Beyond Greece, their legacy resonated in quieter ways. Roman writers admired their devotion, framing them as exemplars of loyalty and discipline. Later, in the Renaissance, when classical ideals were revived, the Sacred Band's story was rediscovered as a parable of devotion and courage. Artists and poets reimagined them, painting the image of lovers dying together in glory. The Lion of Chaeronea, unearthed and restored in modern times, reignited interest, transforming archaeological bones into voices from the past. What is most striking is how the Sacred Band survived as a story even when Thebes itself did not. Cities rise and fall, monuments crumble, empires fade. But memory rooted in love and courage, endures. The band's afterlife was not tied to Theban politics or Greek hegemony, but to something deeper. The universal recognition that devotion makes men brave, and that some bonds are worth dying for. Their story also carried irony. Philip and Alexander, who destroyed the band and their city, were themselves shaped by their example. Philip's army owed its tactics to Theban innovations. Alexander's victories carried lessons learned at Chaeronea. The conquerors inherited the genius of those they conquered. The Sacred Band perished, but their influence lived on in the very empire that erased them. Thebes was gone, but the Sacred Band could not be erased. They lived in Tome, in story, in philosophy, in stone. They became more than Theban. They became eternal. Their afterlife was not measured in power or territory, but in memory. Each retelling of their stand at Chaeronea, each glance at the lion, was proof that they had transcended history to become legend. Thus, the Sacred Band achieved what all warriors seek: immortality not of body, but of name. Their city fell, their enemies triumphed, but their story lived. And in that story, Thebes itself lived too, not as walls or armies, but as devotion incarnate. The Sacred Band of Thebes died to the last man at Chaeronea in 338 BCE, yet their story did not perish with them. Instead, it lived on, woven into the fabric of Greek memory and later into the imagination of distant ages. They became more than warriors of a lost city. They became symbols of devotion, courage, and the paradox of love entwined with war. Their legacy reached beyond Thebes, beyond Greece, beyond antiquity itself. In the centuries after their annihilation, Greek and Roman writers preserved their story. Plutarch, himself a Boeotian, gave the most enduring account, describing their courage and the reverence even Philip of Macedon showed upon finding their bodies. His words immortalized them not merely as soldiers, but as moral exemplars, men whose devotion transcended death. For Plutarch's readers in Rome and beyond, the Sacred Band embodied ideals that resonated with universal human longings: loyalty, sacrifice, and the power of love to inspire courage. Roman thinkers, steeped in admiration for Greek culture, found in the band a parable of discipline and devotion. To Romans, who valued loyalty, fides, and collective duty, the idea of 300 men dying together without retreat resonated with their own military ethos. Yet the band was also something uniquely Greek, an army built on eros, the love between partners, rather than abstract duty. To the Romans, this was both exotic and admirable, a reminder that courage has many forms. During the long centuries of late antiquity and the Middle Ages, the Sacred Band's story dimmed but never disappeared. It was preserved in manuscripts, whispered in chronicles, remembered in fragments of Plutarch and later commentators. Their lion at Chaeronea, half buried and broken, stood as mute testimony even when few recalled its meaning. Yet when the Renaissance rekindled fascination with the classical world, their story bloomed anew. Humanist scholars rediscovered Plutarch's writings, and artists and poets were captivated by the image of lovers dying together in defense of freedom. In Renaissance Europe, the Sacred Band was reinterpreted in the light of humanist ideals. For some, they symbolized the harmony of love and virtue, proving that passion could elevate men to nobility. For others, they represented tragic devotion, a reminder that all beauty is fleeting. Painters imagined them in gleaming armor, poets sang of their last stand, and philosophers debated the meaning of their love. They were no longer simply a Greek military unit. They became universal emblems of the intertwining of eros and honor. In the modern age, their legacy deepened further. The discovery of the mass grave at Chaeronea in the 19th century, where archaeologists unearthed rows of skeletons buried side by side, reignited fascination. The restored lion of Chaeronea, placed once more above their tomb, turned legend into palpable history. Bones aligned in rows, some entwined, gave physical proof to Plutarch's words. The Sacred Band was no longer only story but archaeology, their devotion carved into both memory and earth. The 19th and 20th centuries, with their own struggles over love, identity, and courage, found in the Sacred Band a profound symbol. For those fighting for recognition of same-sex love, the band became proof that such devotion had been honored, not hidden, in the ancient world. They stood as examples that love between men was not weakness but strength, capable of forging the most formidable warriors of their age. Writers, activists, and historians pointed to them as a challenge to modern prejudices, reclaiming their story as part of a broader human heritage. At the same time, military historians admired their role as innovators. The Sacred Band exemplified the use of elite corps, permanent standing units, and cohesion as decisive tools in warfare. Their victories at Tegera and Leuctra influenced military thought for centuries, their oblique tactics studied as precursors to later innovations. Thus, they were remembered not only for love but for strategy, not only for devotion but for discipline. In popular imagination, the Sacred Band lives as one of the great romantic tragedies of history. Like the Spartans at Thermopylae, they became symbols of noble death, standing against overwhelming odds. Yet, unlike Thermopylae, their sacrifice was not for abstraction but for each other. The intimacy of their bond sets them apart, transforming their death into something deeply human. They are remembered not as faceless warriors, but as pairs of lovers who chose to stand and fall together. Their legacy also speaks to the universal human desire to unite private love with public duty. In most societies, love and war are separated. The intimacy of personal bonds belongs at home, while the discipline of soldiers belongs to the battlefield. The Sacred Band blurred that boundary. They proved that the two could be fused, that the tenderness of love could fuel the ferocity of war. This paradox continues to inspire reflection today, as scholars, soldiers, and lovers alike ask what it means to fight not only for a city or country, but for the person beside you. In Thebes, their city was destroyed, rebuilt, and diminished, but their memory endured. The Lion of Chaeronea remained a pilgrimage site for those who sought to honor courage. In Greece today, the band is remembered as part of the Hellenic legacy, proof that even small cities can produce greatness, and that love can shape history. Their story, once whispered in ancient symposia, now resonates across the world as one of the most unique and enduring tales of human devotion. In the end, the Sacred Band of Thebes achieved what they sought: immortality, not through conquest or empire, but through memory. They live wherever courage is honored, wherever love is celebrated, wherever the question is asked, what bond makes men brave? Their answer was clear, written in their lives and in their deaths. It is love that makes courage unbreakable, love that makes warriors immortal. The Sacred Band of Thebes is one of history's most luminous paradoxes. They were not the largest army, nor the wealthiest, nor the most enduring. Their city fell, their bodies lie buried beneath a mound at Chaeronea, and their enemies, first Philip and then Alexander, reshaped the world without them. Yet their story outlives empires. Why? Because they remind us that courage is not born from numbers or weapons, but from bonds that cannot be broken. For centuries, philosophers speculated on what makes men brave. Plato imagined that an army of lovers would be invincible. Xenophon insisted discipline alone was enough. The Sacred Band made philosophy flesh. They proved on the field of battle that love, far from being a weakness, could be the strongest foundation of loyalty. At Tegera they broke Spartan commanders. At Leuctra they shattered Spartan supremacy. At Mantinea they stood as the hammer of Theban power. And at Chaeronea, though surrounded, they refused to yield. In life they were unbeaten. In death they were unbroken. Their legacy is not merely military, but profoundly human. In their devotion, we glimpse a universal truth. People fight hardest not for abstract ideals alone, but for each other. Nations speak of liberty, cities of honor, generals of victory, but at the front line, it is the face beside you that holds you firm. The Sacred Band made that truth explicit. Their courage was inseparable from their love. Their immortality lies in the reminder that intimacy can be as powerful as strategy, that tenderness can harden into resolve, that the bonds of the heart can shape the fate of nations. And yet, their story is tinged with tragedy. They fell not because they lacked devotion, but because history changed around them. Macedon, forged in part by the very lessons they embodied, brought innovations they could not match. Their deaths at Chaeronea were not failure, but inevitability, the meeting of old courage with new power. But in that inevitability lies their greatness. They did not retreat. They stood as symbols of defiance against the tide, choosing to die as they had lived, side by side, loyal to one another until the end. The Lion of Chaeronea, carved in solemn stone, still watches over their resting place. To travelers then and now, it proclaims not defeat but devotion. The city that birthed them is gone, its walls razed, its temples reduced to rubble. Yet the lion endures, and so does the story. Thebes is remembered today not for its wealth or power, but for the Sacred Band. They are its voice across millennia, its gift to history. Their meaning reaches far beyond Thebes or Greece. In every age, humans search for what binds us together in the face of hardship. For some, it is faith. For others, duty. For others still, love. The Sacred Band teaches us that these bonds are not mutually exclusive, that love can be the root of duty, and duty the expression of love. They remind us that courage is not only about conquest, but about constancy, standing firm for what and for whom one cares most deeply. In a world that often separates love from strength, the Sacred Band reunites them. They whisper across time that valor is not diminished by tenderness, nor loyalty by passion. They remind us that history is not only about empires and victories, but about the intimate bonds that give meaning to sacrifice. Their story is at once a tragedy of defeat and a triumph of devotion, a paradox that makes them immortal. The Sacred Band of Thebes is gone, but their question remains: what makes courage unbreakable? Their answer, written in bronze and blood, in stone and silence, is simple and eternal: